Chapter 2. Camping. Mr. Walsh, the farmer, met the boys at the station. He arrived in an old farm truck, got down from it, and stood and looked at the boys for a minute. Then he said, "Well, you've arrived." He wasn't a big man, but he looked very strong. "Get yourselves into the back of the truck," he said, "and don't stand up if you want to arrive in one piece." The boys soon understood what he meant. There were no seats in the back of the truck, and Mr. Walsh drove very fast. They were soon falling about everywhere, and they had to hold on to their bags and camping things. The truck left the town and climbed into the hills. After a while, it stopped suddenly, and the boys got down and slowly looked around. On their left, there were fields with stone walls around them, and on their right, a big white house and the farm buildings. "Well, this is your field," said Mr. Walsh. "Bring your things and follow me." He went through a gate into the nearest field, and the boys hurried after him. "Put your tents here," Mr. Walsh said. "This is a good place." He looked at the three boys, one by one, then spoke to Matty. "Three things to remember, right? Always shut gates behind you. Don't light fires in the woods. And no noise or shouting after 10 o'clock at night. Now, put your tents up and then come to the house to get some milk. And perhaps Mrs. Walsh will have some tea for you." And for the first time he smiled. Then he walked away. "I like the sound of that tea," said Willie happily. "But he wasn't very friendly at first, was he?" "Come on," said Matty. "Let's get these tents up." The boys worked hard, and soon they were walking across to the farmhouse and knocking on the door. A girl of about 12 years old opened it. She had a round face, laughing gray-green eyes, and long brown hair. "They're here, Mom," she called. A small, kind-looking woman came to the door. "Come in," she said, in a soft, slow voice. She asked the boys their names, then turned to her daughter. "This is Jessica," she said. "Now sit down and we'll get you some tea." It was a large farmhouse tea, and the hungry boys ate nearly everything on the table. When they finished, they thanked Mrs. Walsh and left the house to go back to their field. Jessica went with them and talked and laughed with Joe and Willie. Matty wasn't very pleased about this. Girls are always trouble, he thought. He felt angry, and when Jessica took Joe and Willie to show them the stream, Matty stayed behind at the tents. "I'm not running after a girl," he said to himself. But suddenly he felt very alone. When the others came back, they didn't bring any water with them. "Forgot to take the bucket," said Willie. "You're a fine camper," said Matt crossly. "I'll get it myself." He took the bucket and began to walk across the field to find the stream. Then he heard someone behind him, and Jessica ran up. "I'll show you the best place to get drinking water," she said. She ran past him, down the hill, and Matty followed. The stream ran quickly, falling down over rocks, talking and laughing to itself. The water was bright and silvery in the sunlight, and on the other side of the stream were tall green plants with purple flowers. Matty just stood and looked at it. "How beautiful it is," he thought. "I'd like to stay here forever." He looked up the hills, all around him, and the mountains behind. Then he remembered the shipbuilding job which was waiting for him. There are no streams or hills or mountains in the town. Suddenly, he saw Jessica. higher up the stream. She was watching his face with interest. "It's wonderful, this place," he said slowly. "I've never seen anything like it." "It gets very cold in winter," said Jessica. "Your fingers turn blue and fall off." Matt smiled. "Well, you've still got 10 of them." That first night, the boys could not get to sleep. Outside the tents, everything was dark and silent. In a town, there's always some noise, and this lonely field high in the hills was too quiet for them. But they were tired, and in the end, they fell asleep. The next morning, they cooked their breakfast over a fire and then went up to the farm to get some milk. Mr. Walsh was standing outside the cowshed. "Would you like to see around the farm?" he asked. "Oh, yes," said Joe and Willie. Mr. Walsh finished milking the cows, and then he walked around the farm with the boys. He showed them all the animals and explained all the work of the farm. Matty listened carefully to every word, but it was Joe and Willie who asked most of the questions. Suddenly, Mr. Walsh turned to Matty and said, "You haven't got much to say." "Oh, Matt is always quiet, Mr. Walsh," said Joe. Matt didn't like it when people talked about him. He turned his head away and looked across at another building. Then, "Oh, look," he cried, "you've got dogs." "Of course we've got dogs," said Mr. Walsh. "This is a sheep farm. You can't keep sheep on these hills without dogs to help you." The 2 sheepdogs came up to the boys. Joe and Willie tried to make friends with them, but the bigger dog wasn't interested. Matt just stood and watched. Then the bigger dog came over to Matty and looked up at him. Matty slowly and lovingly stroked its ears. "That's Betsy," Mr. Walsh said. "She's 7, and that's her son, Prince." He watched Matty. "That's strange. Betsy doesn't usually like people touching her." "I like dogs." Matty's voice was soft. He went on stroking the dog's ears. "Matty loves dogs," Joe said. "That's why we're here. His dog was killed by a car, and it was his mother who—" "It wasn't my mother," Matt said angrily. "Ah, right. All right. There's no need to get angry, boy," said Mr. Walsh. "Off you go now. I've got work to do."